So whenever a conflict kicks off somewhere like the Strait of Hormuz, you know the headlines. They all jump straight to oil prices, right? How much is it going to cost you at the pump? But that's really just the tip of the iceberg. What we're going to do here is peel back those headlines to get to the story that's way more critical and frankly a lot more human. We're talking about global food security.
And that really brings us to the core question, doesn't it? Why does a conflict happening thousands of miles away end up hitting the world's poorest kitchens the hardest? I mean, how does that connection even work? It seems so distant. Well, let's dive in and unpack it.
The whole thing is basically a story of compounding crises. You can think of it like a ripple effect. It all starts with that big oil shock, but it doesn't stop there. We're going to follow those ripples, one after another, and see how they grow from a splash in the global market into a tidal wave that crashes right into a family's kitchen.
All right, so the first domino to fall is the oil shock itself. But here's the thing that's so important to get right from the start. This shock, it's not an equal opportunity crisis. Not even close. There's a fundamental, kind of built-in unfairness to how it all plays out.
Yeah, economists have a term for this. They call it a regressive shock. It sounds complicated, but it's actually a pretty simple and harsh idea. When something essential like food gets more expensive, the market basically turns into an auction. And who wins an auction? The person with the most money. Wealthier countries can just outbid the poorer ones. It's an economic force that ends up pulling food away from the people who need it the most and toward those who can afford it. Okay, so we've got this big picture idea of a regressive shock. But what does that actually feel like? How does a global price shift hit an actual family, at the household level? This is where it gets real. 52%. Just look at that number for a second. What could that possibly be? Well, this single number is the key. It's the key to understanding everything about how this crisis plays out at home. So here's what it is. That 52%, that's how much of their income a typical family in a low-income country spends just on food. Over half. Now compare that to high-income countries. For them, it's just 12%. That gap, that massive difference is what creates this incredible vulnerability. It's a financial cliff edge.
So let's put that into perspective. Imagine food prices go up by 10%. For that family in a low-income country, that's like taking a 5.2% pay cut. I mean, that's a devastating blow. For the family in a high-income country, it's more like a 1.2% pay cut. It's an annoyance, sure, but it's manageable. You see the difference? What's an inconvenience for one is a full-blown crisis for the other.
Okay, so now let's pull back from the individual household and look at the bigger, global picture again. Because it gets worse. There's another hidden piece of the puzzle here, a factor that takes these price hikes and just pours gasoline on the fire.
And it's this idea of thin markets. Now, this is kind of wild when you first hear it. You think that tons of food is shipped all over the world, right? But the reality is, most staple foods, we're talking rice, wheat, corn, are eaten in the very same country where they're grown. Only a tiny fraction of it actually gets traded internationally.
And that is where things get really dangerous. For example, only about 10% of all the rice grown in the world gets traded across borders. For wheat, it's about 25%. So what happens when a war or a drought messes with that small traded amount? Well, you get these massive, out-of-control price spikes. All the countries that depend on imports, often in the most food-insecure places like sub-Saharan Africa, are suddenly thrown into a frantic bidding war for a much smaller pie.
And yeah, just when you think it can't get any more complicated, there is a third ripple, a third layer that makes this whole situation even worse. And it all comes down to one thing, the US dollar.
People call this the dollar double whammy. And here's how it works. First, all these big food commodities like wheat and corn, they're priced in US dollars, so the dollar price is already going up. But then, part two, when there's a global crisis, investors get scared. They sell off other currencies and buy US dollars because it's seen as safe. This makes the dollar stronger and all those other local currencies weaker. So not only is the food more expensive, but the money you need to buy it has also gotten more expensive. You get hit from both sides.
And the math on this is it's brutal. Let's say the price of wheat jumps 15%. At the same time, your local currency gets 10% weaker against the dollar. You're not just dealing with a 15% price hike anymore. Nope. The real cost for you to import that food just shot up by 26%. It's a killer combination. Okay, so let's recap. We've got the initial price shock that hurts the poor the most. We've got the thin markets that act like an amplifier, making the price swings huge. And then we've got the dollar double whammy that makes everything even more expensive. All these ripples we've been following, they're now converging into one final devastating wave. And this is the one that can push entire countries to the brink. And you have to remember, many low-income countries are already starting from a really tough position. I mean, look at this list of challenges. They're heavily dependent on imports for energy, for food, and even for the fertilizer they need to grow their own food. They have to pay for all of it in those increasingly expensive dollars, and they just don't have the government cash reserves to soften the blow for their citizens.
This chart really says it all. It shows you the total combined impact of all those factors. It's not one single thing, it's everything stacked on top of each other. And the result? Low-income countries are anywhere from 4 to 9 times more exposed to an energy shock like this than wealthy nations are. That's not a small difference. It is a staggering systemic disadvantage.
And this even hits the helpers, the aid organizations. The World Food Program summed it up perfectly with this quote, "For the same money, you get less." Think about that. Their budgets are shrinking in real terms. The money people donate buys less food and less fuel to deliver it, and this is happening at the exact moment that more and more people are desperate for help. It's a cruel irony.
318 million. Just let that number sit for a moment. It's almost impossible to comprehend.
Because that isn't just a statistic. That's the number of people, men, women, and children, who are on the edge of acute hunger. Their lifeline, the humanitarian aid they depend on, is being stretched thinner and thinner because of every single economic ripple we've just talked about. This is where the story ends, with 318 million real human lives hanging in the balance. So that leaves us with a final question to think about. We're so used to measuring these crises in dollars and cents, prices per barrel, market percentages. But as we've just seen, the real impact, the shock waves, they're measured in calories. They're felt at the kitchen table. So what really is the true cost when a crisis is measured not just in dollars, but in human lives?